The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1876, and by Thursday, Alberta Sawyer had cut off 11 inches of her hair with a pair of sewing shears and burned every dress she owned that could not be altered into trousers. The letter had come from a lawyer in Larkspur Crossing, Wyoming Territory, informing her that her father, Thomas Sawyer, had died of pneumonia in the dead of February, and that the 320 acres of bottomland he had claimed along Willow Creek 5 years prior would revert to the public domain unless his lawful heir appeared in person before the Territorial Land Office within 60 days to file final proof of residency and improvement. 60 days. She had read that number so many times the ink had nearly worn from the paper beneath her thumb. Her father was gone, and with him the only family she had left in the world, and now some clerk with a rubber stamp intended to take the last thing Thomas Sawyer had ever built simply because his only child had been born a daughter instead of a son. She was 22 years old, living in St. Joseph, Missouri, with an aunt who had never much cared for her, and she had precisely $400, a trunk of her mother's old jewelry, and a stubbornness that her father had always said would either save her life or end it. She intended to find out which. There was a second letter tucked inside the first one, this one not from the lawyer but from a rancher named Silas Draven, who fancied himself the largest cattle man in that stretch of the territory. He wrote with false condolence, offering to purchase the claim from her, sight unseen, for a sum so small it insulted the memory of every year her father had spent breaking that ground. Alberta understood the offer for what it was. Silas Draven did not want to buy a widow's daughter out of kindness. He wanted the water. Willow Creek ran through the Sawyer land and nowhere else for 20 miles, and whoever held that water held every ranch downstream by the throat. She had heard enough stories, even in St. Joseph, about what happened to lone women traveling into the territories. She had heard of stage lines that would not sell a ticket to an unescorted lady past Fort Laramie, of claim jumpers who watched the land offices for grieving widows and orphan daughters the way wolves watched a wounded calf. She did not doubt that a man like Silas Draven, with money enough to write threatening letters dressed up as sympathy, had eyes watching the roads for exactly the kind of traveler she would be. A woman alone, heading toward Larkspur Crossing, carrying a dead man's claim in her satchel. So she became a man. Not a disguise she wore lightly, and not one she expected to enjoy, but a plain and practical solution to a plain and practical problem. She bound her chest with linen strips, put on a pair of her late father's trousers taken in at the waist by her own needle, wore his old canvas coat, and pulled a wide-brimmed hat low over eyes that had always been, her aunt said, entirely too much like her mother's. She called herself Bert Sawyer, her father's nephew come west to settle the estate. It was not so great a lie. She was, after all, still a Sawyer, and she was, after all, coming to settle what belonged to her. The stagecoach out of Cheyenne rattled her bones for 2 full days before it broke an axle 40 miles short of Larkspur Crossing, on a stretch of road where the grass rolled gold and endless beneath a sky so wide it made her chest ache with something between wonder and terror. She had never seen country like it. It seemed to swallow a person whole, and she was suddenly and completely aware of how alone she was, how far from anyone who had ever loved her, how entirely the next 60 days depended on nobody discovering that Bert Sawyer wore a dead woman's mother's wedding ring on a string beneath his shirt. It was there, on that broken road, that she met Hugh Mercer. He came riding up out of the west with the sun behind him, so that for a moment he was only a shape, a man and a horse cut black against the burning sky, and Alberta's hand found the pistol her father had left her before she remembered she was meant to look like she knew how to use it without fear. He reined up a respectful distance from the stranded coach, tipped his hat to the driver, and asked in an easy voice whether anyone had been hurt. "Axles broke clean through," the driver said, spitting into the dust. "We are 3 men and a boy short of the tools to fix it proper, and darkness is coming on." I have got rope and a hatchet and a fair hand with wood, Hugh Mercer said, swinging down from his horse. It will not be pretty, but it will get you rolling come morning. He was, Alberta thought, watching him from the shadow of the coach door, perhaps 30 years old, sun-browned and lean in the particular way of men who worked outdoors for a living rather than merely rode through it for pleasure. He wore a gray flannel shirt gone soft with washing, a battered hat, and a gun belt worn low but without the swagger of a man who wanted anyone to notice it. His eyes, when they passed over her, were a clear pale brown, like creek water running over stone, and they lingered on her for half a second longer than they had on the driver or the other passengers, as though something about the slight, dark-haired young man in the oversized coat did not quite add up. "You are welcome to make camp with me tonight," Hugh said to the group at large, though Alberta felt the words settle on her particularly. "There is a spring a half-mile back with good water and grass for the horses. I am headed to Larkspur Crossing myself, if any of you are bound that way." "That is my destination," Alberta said, and was relieved to hear that her voice, pitched low and practiced these 3 days, did not waver. Bert Sawyer. Hugh Mercer. He extended a hand and she shook it, grateful her father's leather-work gloves hid the smallness of her fingers. His grip was firm but not crushing, the grip of a man used to sizing up cattle and horses and other men in the same practical glance. Sawyer. Any relation to Thomas Sawyer, out on Willow Creek? Her heart lurched so hard she feared he might see it beating through her coat. "He was my uncle," she said. "I am come to settle his affairs." Something crossed Hugh's face then, quick as a cloud shadow over grass. Sorrow, she thought, or perhaps only surprise. "I am sorry to hear it," he said. "Thomas Sawyer was a good man, fair with his neighbors, which is more than I can say for some in this country." He did not elaborate, but the set of his jaw when he said it told her he was thinking of Silas Draven, and that whatever he thought of the cattle baron, it was not admiration. They made camp by the spring as the sky went the color of a healing bruise, purple and gold, and finally a deep and star-scattered black. Alberta sat carefully apart from the fire's brightest light, her hat still on, her collar turned up, eating her share of the beans Hugh had produced from his saddlebags with a wariness that made her hands clumsy. She was unused to sleeping among strangers, unused to the particular danger of being close to a fire that might show too much of her face, unused to a man who watched the world as carefully as Hugh Mercer seemed to watch it. "You have not done much riding," Hugh observed, not unkindly, as she winced dismounting a second time to fetch water. "No offense meant. It is a hard thing to learn young and harder to learn old. I grew up in Missouri," she said, which was true enough. There was not much call for it there. "Well, there will be call enough for it here." He handed her a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter and better than anything she had tasted in 3 days of travel. "Larkspur Crossing is cattle country now, whatever it might once have been. You will want to learn to sit a horse properly if you mean to hold that claim." "You know of it, then, my uncle's claim?" Hugh was quiet a moment, staring into the fire. "Everybody in 40 miles knows of it," he said finally. "Willow Creek is the only reliable water between the Sweetwater and the Platte that is not already spoken for. Silas Draven has been trying to buy your uncle out for 2 years, and when Thomas would not sell, Draven took to grazing his cattle right up to the property line, fouling the creek upstream where he could get away with it, generally making a nuisance of himself. I always thought it was only a matter of time before he tried something worse." He glanced up, and his pale eyes found hers across the firelight. "You should know that, if you mean to hold that land. Draven does not lose gracefully, and he does not lose often, on account of he does not often play fair." "I intend to hold it," Alberta said, and this time there was no need to disguise the iron in her voice because it was entirely her own. "It is mine by right, and I will not be frightened off it by a man who thinks money makes him a king." Hugh's eyebrows lifted slightly, and for a moment something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That is a strong sentiment for a fellow who has never sat a horse." "I can learn to sit a horse," she said. "I'm not sure Silas Draven can learn to be decent." That drew a real laugh from him, low and warm, and it startled her how much she liked the sound of it, how it eased something tight in her chest that had not loosened once since the letter arrived. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose he can." They rode into Larkspur Crossing 2 days later. The coach mended well enough to limp the remaining distance, with Hugh Mercer riding easy alongside, as though he had simply chosen to accompany them rather than admit, as Alberta was beginning to suspect he might, that he did not entirely trust a stranger fresh off the stage to make it safely into a town where a man like Silas Draven held more sway than the sheriff. Larkspur Crossing was not large, not by the standards of the cities she had known, but it was alive in a way St. Joseph had never seemed to be. A single wide street of packed dirt ran between a general store, a saloon with a false front painted a fading red, a smithy sending up sparks into the afternoon light, a church with a steeple that looked recently built, and a squat log building with a hand-painted sign that read Land Office in letters still faintly smelling of paint. Horses stood hitched along the rails, and a knot of children chased a dog between the buildings, and somewhere a piano was being played with more enthusiasm than skill. It looked, Alberta thought, like a town that intended to become a city if the right people were allowed to build it, and the wrong ones were kept from tearing it down first. She took a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Higgins, who asked no questions about a young man traveling alone so long as his money was good, and who fed her a supper of stew and cornbread that was the first hot meal Alberta had eaten in a week that had not been cooked over an open fire. Hugh Mercer, she learned, kept a small room above the livery stable when he was not out working, and he came by the boarding house the next morning to walk with her to the land office, an offer she accepted with more relief than she wanted to admit. The land office clerk was a narrow, ferret-faced man named Otis Prout, who looked up from his ledger with an expression that curdled the moment Alberta gave her name. "Sawyer," he repeated, as though tasting something sour. "Thomas Sawyer's nephew. That is correct." She kept her voice low and even, the way she had practiced in the mirror of her aunt's house 100 times before ever setting foot on the stage. "I am here to file final proof on the claim and take up residency, as is my right as his heir." Prout's eyes flicked toward Hugh, standing a pace behind her with his hat in his hands, and something passed between the two men that Alberta could not quite read. "There is a great deal of paperwork involved in a matter like this," Prout said slowly. "Proof of relation, proof of the deceased's original filing. It is not a thing done in an afternoon." "I have brought what documents I could," Alberta said, and set her father's original claim papers, along with a copy of the letter from the territorial lawyer, on the counter between them. "I understand the deadline is 60 days from the date of that letter. I intend to meet it." Prout made a show of examining the papers, turning them over with fingers that seemed reluctant to touch them at all, and Alberta felt the first cold thread of fear work its way up her spine. This man did not want her to succeed. She could see it in the studied blankness of his face, the way his eyes kept sliding toward the window as though checking whether someone outside might be watching this exchange, someone whose good opinion mattered more to Otis Prout than the law he was sworn to uphold. "These will need to be reviewed," Prout said at last. "Come back in a week." "A week," Hugh said, stepping forward before Alberta could argue, his voice pleasant but with an edge beneath it like a blade wrapped in cloth. "Otis, you and I both know the territorial statute gives the heir 30 days to file once they arrive in the district, and no cause for delay beyond verifying the documents are genuine, which those plainly are, seeing as I watched Thomas Sawyer sign that very claim with my own eyes 5 years back. I do not believe you mean to suggest Bert here ought to wait about while Silas Draven has time to make other arrangements." Prout's jaw tightened. "I am only following procedure, Mercer." "Then follow it quick," Hugh said, still pleasant, still smiling, but there was no mistaking the warning in it. "Because I intend to come back with him in 3 days, and I intend for you to have those papers filed and stamped by then, or I will be writing a letter of my own to the territorial governor's office about how the Larkspur Land Office conducts its procedures." They left Otis Prout glowering behind his counter, and once they were out on the street again, Alberta let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said. "I do not know what I would have done." "You would have managed," Hugh said, though he looked pleased at the thanks regardless. "There is no shame in a little help, especially not against a man like Prout, who has been in Silas Draven's pocket since before I ever came to this country. You will want to watch yourself around both of them, Bert. Draven does not confront a man in the open when he can arrange for trouble to find him some darker way." She would remember those words later, when the trouble came. For the first 2 weeks, life in Larkspur Crossing settled into something Alberta had not expected: a rhythm. She rode out to Willow Creek most mornings with Hugh Mercer, who had, it turned out, worked for her father in years past, mending fence and driving cattle to market, and who knew the land nearly as well as she now realized she did not know it at all. The cabin her father had built stood weathered but sound at the top of a gentle rise above the creek, 2 rooms and a stone chimney, with a barn behind it that needed a new roof, and a corral that needed mending and fields that needed plowing if she meant to prove up the claim with the improvements the law required. It was, she thought, the first time she stood inside it, breathing in the smell of her father that still somehow lingered in the wood, both the loneliest and the most rightfully hers place she had ever stood. Hugh taught her to ride properly, correcting her seat with a patience that surprised her, given how badly she must have looked at first atop a horse. He taught her to mend fence, to read the weather in the shape of clouds gathering over the western hills, to recognize the tracks of deer and coyote, and the cattle that Silas Draven's men let wander too near the property line, more often than seemed accidental. He never asked her why a city-raised nephew from Missouri knew so little of ranch work, and she began to suspect, with a nervousness that sat uneasy in her stomach, that he had already guessed there was more to Bert Sawyer's story than he was letting on. The suspicion became certainty on an afternoon in early May, when a sudden thunderstorm caught them both out mending fence a mile from the cabin, and they took shelter beneath a rock overhang as the rain came down in gray sheets and lightning cracked white across the hills. Alberta, soaked through her father's canvas coat, had pulled off her hat to wring the water from it, and the motion, quick and unthinking, loosened the pins that held the shortened remains of her hair pulled tight against her skull. A length of it, dark and wet, fell loose across her cheek, and she saw Hugo very still beside her. "Alberta," he said quietly, testing the name as though he had been carrying it in his mouth for days, waiting for the right moment to set it down. "Alberta Sawyer, Thomas's daughter." She could not speak for a moment. The rain roared against the rock above them, and lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, and she saw there was no anger in it, no disgust, only a kind of dawning wonder, and beneath that, something that looked almost like fear on her behalf. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "I suspected from the first night at the fire," he admitted. "There was something about the way you moved, the way you spoke when you thought no one was listening close. And Thomas spoke of you more than once in the years I rode for him. He never had a nephew. He had a daughter he was fiercely proud of, back east, learning her letters and her numbers, and he used to say she had more grit in her little finger than most men he knew had in their whole bodies." His pale eyes searched her face. "I did not want to believe it, because if it was true, it meant you had ridden 200 miles alone, disguised, into country where men like Silas Draven would think nothing of running off a woman who could not defend her claim, and I did not like to think of you facing that kind of danger." "I did what I had to do," Alberta said, and to her own surprise her voice broke slightly on the words, all the fear and grief and exhaustion of the past 3 weeks rising up at once now that there was no longer any need to hold it behind a mask. "My father is dead, Hugh. He is dead, and I was not there, and the only thing I have left of him is that cabin and that creek and that land, and I was not about to let some corrupt clerk and some greedy cattle baron take it from me simply because the law does not trust a woman to hold what is rightfully hers." "The law is wrong, then," Hugh said simply, and something in the plainness of it, the total lack of hesitation, undid her more than any grand speech could have. You have more right to that land than any man in this territory, seeing as you are the one who loved your father and the one he wished to leave it to. I will not tell a soul what I know, Alberta Sawyer. Not Prout, not Draven, not the sheriff, not anyone. Your secret is safe with me for as long as you need it kept. Why? She asked, searching his face in the gray storm light. Why would you take that risk? If it were discovered you had helped me deceive the land office, you could face trouble yourself. Hugh was quiet a long moment, water dripping from the brim of his hat, and when he answered, his voice was low and rough in a way she had not heard from him before. Because your father was kind to me when I had nothing and no one in this territory, and because I have watched you these 3 weeks ride out at dawn and work until your hands bled and never once complain, and because I do not believe a woman with that much courage in her ought to lose everything simply for the crime of being born a woman in a country that does not yet know what to do with that kind of courage. He paused. And because, if I am honest with myself, which I am trying to be, I have found myself thinking of you a great deal more than is proper for a man thinking of his old friend's nephew. The rain had begun to slacken, and somewhere beyond the hills the thunder was retreating into a low, distant grumble, and Alberta stood beneath that rock overhang with her hair coming loose around her face and her heart beating very fast, and understood, with the sudden clarity of lightning itself, that she had begun to feel something similar, something she had not let herself examine too closely on the long rides and longer evenings of the past 3 weeks. Because she had told herself there was no room in her life just now for anything but survival. I do not know what to say, she admitted. You need not say anything, Hugh said, and the smile that touched his mouth then was gentler than any she had seen from him before. We have got a claim to prove, and a deadline bearing down on us, and a man who wants both of us gone from this country one way or another. There will be time enough for saying things, once that is settled. She held on to that promise in the weeks that followed, even as the danger around her sharpened into something with teeth. It began small. A section of fence found cut, and the cattle her father had left, 6 head that Hugh had been tending alongside his own work, scattered halfway to the Sweetwater before they managed to gather them back. Then a night when someone crept close enough to the cabin to leave a dead rattlesnake coiled on the porch step, a message plain enough that Alberta did not sleep again that night without her father's pistol beneath her pillow. Then, worst of all, a morning when Hugh rode out to check the line shack at the edge of the property and did not return by dark, so that Alberta spent 6 hours pacing the length of the cabin with her heart in her throat, imagining every terrible thing that might have befallen him, before he came limping in on foot, his horse gone lame from a hidden wire strung low across the trail, his temple bleeding from where he had been thrown, but alive and furious, and more concerned with her worry than his own injury. It was Draven's men, he said, as Alberta cleaned the cut above his eye with water warmed at the hearth, her hands shaking with a fear only now permitting itself to be felt. I recognized one of the horses, that big gray gelding Curly Watts rides. They meant to spook my horse and leave me afoot out there, maybe hoping I would not make it back before dark, or maybe hoping I would break my neck in the fall. Either way, it is meant as a warning. A warning for what? Alberta demanded, though she feared she already knew. For helping you, Hugh said. Draven knows I have been out here every day. He is no fool, whatever else he is. He may not know your secret, but he knows I mean to see you keep this land, and he means to make that as costly as he can for both of us. Then we should go to the sheriff. Hugh's laugh was short and bitter. Sheriff Dunmore takes his supper twice a week at Draven's table, and his salary, some say, comes partly from Draven's pocket besides the county's. There is no help to be found there. Our best hope is to hold on until the deadline, get your final proof filed and stamped and witnessed proper, and let the law itself be your shield. Once that claim is settled and recorded, Draven cannot touch it without breaking the law outright in front of witnesses, and even a man as bold as he is knows better than to do that. The deadline. Alberta had tried not to count the days too closely, but she could not help it now, lying awake that night listening to Hugh's breathing from where he had insisted on sleeping across the cabin's threshold with his rifle beside him, refusing to leave her alone and unguarded after what had happened. 22 days remained. 22 days to complete the improvements the law required, to gather witnesses willing to swear to her residency, to survive whatever else Silas Draven decided to throw at her, all while maintaining the disguise that had gotten her this far and that now felt, with every passing day, more like a thin and fraying thread than a shield. The town of Larkspur Crossing held a spring social at the end of that week, a dance in the yard behind the church to celebrate the first cutting of hay and the arrival of a new preacher's wife, and Hugh insisted Alberta attend, arguing that a young man newly settled in the district ought to be seen among his neighbors, ought to build goodwill and witnesses both, ought not hide away out at Willow Creek as though he had something to fear. She dressed carefully that evening in her father's good coat, brushed the dust from her boots, and stood at the edge of the gathering feeling more exposed than she had felt in weeks, surrounded by lantern light and fiddle music and the frank, curious stares of people who had heard, by now, of Thomas Sawyer's nephew and his trouble with Silas Draven. It was Hugh who saved her from the worst of that scrutiny, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of lemonade and steering her toward a knot of ranchers who, it emerged, harbored no particular love for Silas Draven themselves. "He has been squeezing every small outfit in this valley for 2 years," said one weathered man, introduced as Amos Wheeler, who ran cattle on the section just south of the Sawyer claim. "Fouling water, running off hands, buying up notes at the bank so he can call them due whenever it suits him to force a man off his land. If your uncle's nephew means to stand up to him, he will find friends enough in this valley, whatever else he finds." "We would be glad of it," Alberta said, and meant it more than Amos Wheeler could know, feeling for the first time since the letter arrived that she was not entirely alone in this fight, that there existed in this rough young town a kind of justice that might yet be appealed to, if only it could be given the chance. Later, when the fiddle slowed into something gentler and couples began to pair off for a dance, Hugh held out his hand to her with a boldness that startled them both. "I do not think it wise," Alberta murmured, glancing at the watching crowd. "2 men dancing together would raise questions I cannot afford." "Then walk with me instead," Hugh said, and led her instead out past the ring of lantern light, out to where the prairie grass rolled dark and silver under a rising moon, and the fiddle music grew soft and distant behind them. "I have wanted to do this for some while," he admitted, once they had gone far enough that no curious eyes could follow, "though I could not, while you were meant to be my old friend's nephew." "Do what?" she asked, though her heart already knew. He reached up, slow enough that she might have stopped him if she wished to, and tucked a loose strand of her dark hair back beneath the brim of her hat, his fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Look at you the way I have wanted to look at you," he said low. "Alberta Sawyer, I do not know when it happened exactly, whether it was that first night at the fire when you argued Silas Draven could not learn to be decent, or some morning out mending fence when you laughed at something foolish I said, but I have come to care for you more than I know how to say plainly, and I find I cannot go on pretending otherwise, not even for the sake of your secret. Hugh." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I am in the middle of the fight of my life. I do not know what will become of me in 3 weeks' time. I do not know if I will still have a home, or a name that is not a lie, or anything at all to offer a man who deserves better than a woman wearing her father's trousers and a stranger's face." "I do not want what you can offer," Hugh said. "I want you. Whatever comes of the claim, whatever comes of Draven and his men and this whole miserable business, I want to stand beside you through it as myself, and I want you standing beside me as yourself. And when this is over, however it ends, I would like very much to ask you to marry me properly, in a church, with your own name spoken over you and not some borrowed one." Alberta stood very still in the moonlight, feeling something crack open in her chest, something she had kept sealed tight since the day her father's letter of death arrived, some reservoir of grief and loneliness and longing that had been waiting. She realized now, for exactly this, to be seen fully, disguise and all, and loved anyway. "Ask me now," she said. "Not because I mean to answer yet, but because I want to have heard it once before whatever comes next." Hugh's smile was slow and full of a tenderness that made her ache. He did not kneel, there being no ring to offer and no certainty yet to build upon, but he took both her hands in his, rough palms against her own work-roughened ones, and said, "Alberta Sawyer, when this is finished, and you are standing on your own land under your own name, I would be the proudest man in this territory if you would consent to be my wife." "Ask me again in 3 weeks," she said, laughing through sudden tears, "and I expect I shall say yes." He kissed her then, softly, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, and for one suspended moment the danger and the deadline and Silas Draven himself seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the two of them and the moonlight and the fiddle music drifting faint across the grass. But the danger had not forgotten them, even if they, for one stolen hour, had forgotten it. 3 days later, Otis Prout sent word that the land office required Alberta to appear in person, alone, to answer questions about the original claim before final proof could be accepted. And when she arrived, she found not only Prout behind his counter but Silas Draven himself, seated comfortably in the office's one good chair as though he owned it, which, given the money he clearly paid Prout under whatever table passed between them, he very likely did in every way that mattered. Silas Draven was not the monster she had imagined in her darker moments. He was a solidly built man of perhaps 50, silver at the temples, dressed in a fine gray suit entirely too clean for a working cattleman, with the soft, assured manner of a man who had never once in his life doubted he would get what he wanted. He rose when she entered, all courtesy, and extended a hand she did not take. "Mr. Sawyer," he said, unbothered by the refusal, "I have heard a great deal about you these past weeks. A pity we have not met sooner. I understand you offered to buy my uncle's claim before I ever arrived," Alberta said, keeping her voice as flat and cold as she could manage. "I am not interested in selling." "Everyone is interested in selling, given the right price," Draven said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "But that is not why I have come today. I have come because I understand there is some question about the legitimacy of your claim to this land." Alberta's stomach dropped, though she kept her face carefully still. "There is no question. I am Thomas Sawyer's nephew, and I have brought papers to prove it." "Papers can be forged," Draven said pleasantly. "Or so I understand. I have taken the liberty of writing to certain contacts of mine back in Missouri, making inquiries into the Sawyer family. It is a curious thing, Mr. Sawyer, but no one I have spoken with recalls Thomas Sawyer ever having a brother, which would rather complicate the existence of a nephew, would it not?" The room seemed to tilt beneath her. She was aware of Prout watching with an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction, aware of the weight of her father's pistol at her hip, aware, with sudden and terrible clarity, of exactly how close Silas Draven had come to unraveling everything. "My uncle had a half-brother," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, drawing on a lie she had prepared weeks ago in anticipation of exactly this kind of scrutiny. "From his mother's second marriage, which is likely why your contacts found no record under the Sawyer name. I would be happy to provide further documentation, should the land office require it, but I would remind you both that territorial statute gives me 30 days from arrival to file, and that day has not yet come, and that harassing a claimant with unfounded accusations while that clock runs down looks, to my eye, a great deal like an attempt to delay a legitimate filing until the deadline lapses." It was a bluff, and a thin one, built on legal language she had absorbed from Hugh over long evenings poring over what statute books they could find in Larkspur Crossing's small library, but it landed harder than she had dared hope. Draven's smile thinned just slightly, and Prout shifted uncomfortably behind his counter. "There is no need for accusations," Draven said smoothly, recovering. I am simply a concerned neighbor, wishing to ensure the law is properly followed. I will withdraw my inquiry for now, Mr. Sawyer, though I trust you will understand if I remain curious about your family history. Curious all you like, Alberta said and turned to go, her legs unsteady beneath her, her heart hammering so hard she feared they might hear it. I have work to do. She did not breathe easily again until she was outside, mounted and riding hard for Willow Creek, and when she reached the cabin and told Hugh what had happened, his face went pale and then hard in a way she had not seen before. He is closing in, Hugh said. If he cannot buy you off and cannot scare you off, he will try to prove you a fraud, and if that fails, I fear he will not stop at fences and dead snakes on the porch step. We have 12 days left, Alberta. We must finish the improvements the law requires, gather every witness we can who saw your father alive and can speak to the claim's legitimacy, and pray that is enough to see this through before Draven finds some new trick. They worked those 12 days as though the sun itself might set on them for good if they slowed. Hugh brought in Amos Wheeler and 2 other neighboring ranchers to help raise a new section of barn roof, satisfying the law's requirement of improvement, while Alberta plowed and planted a kitchen garden behind the cabin with her own 2 hands, blistered and bleeding beneath her father's old work gloves, because the statute required evidence of cultivation, and she would not risk failing that requirement for want of effort. In the evenings, exhausted beyond words, she and Hugh sat together on the cabin porch as the sun sank into the western hills, and he told her stories of her father in years past, small kindnesses and dry jokes, and the particular way Thomas Sawyer had of squinting at the sky before declaring, always correctly, when rain was coming, and Alberta found herself grieving and healing in the same breath, held together by the steady warmth of the man beside her. On the 9th night, disaster came riding in on horseback under cover of darkness. Alberta woke to the smell of smoke and Hugh's shout, and stumbled out of the cabin to find the new barn roof, not yet a week finished, ablaze against the night sky, orange light licking up into the darkness, while 3 riders wheeled their horses away toward the tree line, their laughter carrying back cruel and clear on the wind. Hugh was already running for the well with a bucket, and Alberta joined him without thought for disguise or danger, hauling water in a chain with Amos Wheeler's teenage son, who had been staying in the bunkhouse to help with the plowing, until her arms screamed and her lungs burned with smoke, until finally, exhausted and soot-streaked, they managed to save the walls even as the roof collapsed inward in a shower of sparks. They stood in the wreckage as dawn broke gray and merciless over the hills, and Alberta felt something in her that had held firm through weeks of fear and hardship finally begin to crack. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice raw from smoke and something worse. "I cannot keep fighting a man with that much money and that little conscience. Perhaps I should have sold when he first offered. Perhaps this land is not worth what it is costing." "Do not say that," Hugh said, turning her gently by the shoulders to face him, his own face streaked black with soot, his eyes fierce in a way that steadied something in her chest. "This land is worth everything because it is not truly about the land at all, not anymore. It is about a man believing he can take whatever he wants from whoever he decides is too weak to stop him, and if you walk away now, you prove him right, not only about this claim, but about every widow and every daughter and every small rancher in this valley he has ever bullied. You told me once you would not be frightened off by a man who thinks money makes him a king. I do not believe that woman is gone, Alberta, whatever the fire took last night." She looked at the ruined roof, the blackened timbers, the garden she had planted with her own bleeding hands still green and stubborn in the growing light, and felt something in her steady and harden once more. "You are right," she said. "He burned a roof. He did not burn my resolve, and he will not, however many nights he tries." They rebuilt the roof in 4 days with the whole of Amos Wheeler's family and 2 other neighboring outfits pitching in, word of the fire having spread through the valley and turned sympathy sharply against Sela's Draven, whose men had been careless enough to leave a distinctive branding iron dropped near the tree line, one that Amos Wheeler recognized immediately as belonging to the Draven outfit. It was not proof enough to bring before a corrupted sheriff, but it was proof enough for the valley's own conscience, and Alberta found herself, in the aftermath of near disaster, more surrounded by goodwill and helping hands than she had ever expected to be in a territory that had seemed, weeks before, entirely hostile ground. With 3 days remaining before the deadline, Hugh rode into Larkspur, crossing ahead of her to speak with a territorial marshal who happened to be passing through on other business. A broad, weathered man named Marshal Corbett, who listened to the account of the fire, the cut fences, the scattered cattle, and the dead snake on the porch step with a growing frown, and who agreed, after some persuasion and the testimony of Amos Wheeler regarding the branding iron, to be present at the land office when Alberta came to file her final proof, in case Silas Draven or his allies attempted anything further. The morning of the filing dawned clear and cool, the kind of bright Wyoming morning that seemed to promise good things despite every reason for fear. And Alberta dressed one final time in her father's coat and trousers, bound her hair beneath his hat, and rode into Larkspur, crossing beside Hugh Mercer with her father's original claim papers, her improvement records, and the sworn testimony of 3 neighboring ranchers folded carefully into her satchel. The land office was crowded when they arrived, word having spread through the valley of the coming confrontation, and Alberta saw, with a jolt of mingled fear and grim satisfaction, that Silas Draven himself had come, flanked by 2 of his hired men, along with Otis Prout behind his counter, looking distinctly unhappy at the presence of Marshal Corbett standing solid and watchful near the door. "Mr. Sawyer," Prout said, his voice tight, "I understand you wish to file final proof today." "I do," Alberta said, laying her papers on the counter. "Everything is in order. My uncle's original claim, records of improvement made in the past 60 days, and sworn statements from 3 neighboring landholders attesting to my residency and diligent work upon the claim." Prout made a show of examining the papers, but before he could speak, Silas Draven stepped forward, his earlier smoothness replaced now with something harder, more desperate, the manner of a man who saw the ground shifting beneath a scheme he had counted on succeeding. "Before this filing proceeds," Draven said, "I must renew my concerns regarding this claimant's true identity. I have brought a witness." He gestured, and a thin, nervous man Alberta did not recognize stepped forward from the crowd, someone Draven must have paid or coerced into traveling from wherever he had found him. This man claims to have known Thomas Sawyer's family back in Ohio before he ever came west, and he says Thomas Sawyer had no brother, half or otherwise, and no nephew. The room went very quiet. Alberta felt every eye turned toward her, felt Hugo tense and still beside her, felt the whole careful structure of the past 2 months threatening to collapse in a single moment. "Furthermore," Draven pressed on, sensing weakness, sensing the room's attention gathering behind him now, "I would ask this claimant to remove his hat, that the witness might better examine his face." It was Marshal Corbett who spoke before Alberta could, his voice cutting flat and authoritative across the murmuring crowd. "Now hold on. Before we go accusing a man of fraud on the word of some stranger you have clearly paid to say whatever suits your purposes, Draven, I would remind everyone present that I have spent the last 3 days looking into your own conduct in this matter, on account of a certain branding iron found near a certain burned barn roof. I have a mind to ask you some questions of my own before anyone starts demanding another man remove his hat. This is not your jurisdiction, Marshal," Draven said, color rising in his face. "Arson and destruction of property on a federal land claim is very much my jurisdiction," Corbett said, "as is intimidation of a claimant attempting to file legal proof. I have 3 sworn statements here, gathered yesterday, naming your men as the riders seen fleeing the Sawyer property the night of the fire. So before you go casting doubts on anyone else's honesty, Mr. Draven, Perhaps you would care to explain your own." The room erupted into murmurs, and Draven's paid witness, seeing the tide turn, began edging back toward the door, clearly having no wish to be caught in whatever reckoning was about to fall. In the chaos of the moment, Alberta felt Hugh's hand find hers, brief and fierce, and heard him murmur, "Now, tell them now while the ground is shifting. Better they hear it from your own mouth than have Draven twist it later." She understood in that instant that he was right. The lie of Bert Sawyer had carried her this far, but it could not carry her through a courtroom, through a lifetime, through whatever came after this day. And if the truth was to come out, better it come out now on her own terms, standing tall rather than caught cowering. "Marshal Corbett," Alberta said, and pulled the hat from her head, letting her dark, cropped hair fall loose, and heard the gasp ripple through the crowded room. "My name is not Bert Sawyer. My name is Alberta Sawyer. I am not Thomas Sawyer's nephew. I am his daughter, his only child and his rightful heir, and I disguised myself as a man to travel safely into this territory because I had reason to believe, and have since had that belief entirely confirmed, that certain parties would go to great lengths, including arson and intimidation, to prevent a woman from claiming what was legally and rightfully hers." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas Draven's face had gone the color of ash, whether from fury at being outmaneuvered or shock at the revelation. Alberta could not tell and did not much care. Otis Prout looked as though he wished the floor might open beneath him. "This claim is fraudulent," Draven finally sputtered. "She filed under a false name. The whole proceeding is void." "I do not believe that is so." Marshal Corbett's voice remained maddeningly calm, and he turned to Alberta with an expression that held more respect than judgment. "Miss Sawyer, is it? Under the Homestead Act of 1862, as amended, an unmarried woman who is head of her household has every legal right to file and hold a claim in her own name. There is nothing fraudulent about a woman inheriting her father's land, only about the name under which the paperwork was initially begun. If you are willing to now file properly, under your true and legal name, with the same documentation you have already presented, I see no reason this claim cannot proceed exactly as intended, disguise or no disguise. The land itself was always rightfully yours. The name on the hat you wore changes nothing about the papers in your father's original filing." Otis Prout, caught now between Draven's glare and the marshal's evident authority, seemed to shrink several inches. "I will need the paperwork amended," he said weakly. "Then amend it," Corbett said. "And I would suggest you amend it quickly, and honestly, Prout, because I intend to be reviewing every filing that has crossed your desk in the past 2 years once this matter is settled, given what I have learned this week about the friendliness of your relationship with Mr. Draven here." It took the better part of an hour, but by the time the sun stood high overhead, Alberta Sawyer walked out of the Larkspur Crossing Land Office with a stamped and witnessed certificate of final proof. Her father's 320 acres along Willow Creek legally and permanently recorded in her own true name, safe now from any further scheme Silas Draven might concoct. Draven himself had stormed off before the paperwork was finished, his face like a thundercloud, his 2 hired men trailing uneasily behind him, and Marshal Corbett had promised to keep a close and continuing eye on both him and Otis Prout in the weeks to come, a promise that would, in time, see Prout removed from his post entirely, and Draven forced to answer for the burned barn roof before a territorial judge, paying restitution that emptied a fair portion of his ill-gotten fortune. But in that moment, standing on the dusty street outside the land office with the sun warm on her uncovered hair and Hugh Mercer's hand steady in hers, none of that future reckoning mattered half so much as the simple, overwhelming fact that it was finished. The land was hers, truly, legally, permanently hers. "You did it," Hugh said, his voice thick with something like wonder. "Alberta Sawyer, you rode 200 miles disguised as your own dead father's ghost and outlasted the richest, meanest man in this territory, and you did it with your chin up the entire way." "We did it," she corrected, laughing through sudden tears, exhaustion and relief crashing over her all at once. "I could not have managed a single day of it without you." "Then perhaps," Hugh said, dropping suddenly and without warning to one knee right there in the dusty street, heedless of the small crowd still lingering outside the land office, heedless of anything but her, "you would consider managing the rest of your days with me instead." He did not have a ring. There had been no time nor money for such things amid fires and threats and stolen sleep. But he took from his coat pocket a small, smooth stone from Willow Creek itself, worn round and pale by years of running water, and held it out to her on his open palm. "It is not much," he said, "but it is of this land, the same as you are now truly and legally, and I thought perhaps it might serve until I can afford you something finer. Alberta Sawyer, I love you. I have loved you since a night by a campfire when you told me Selah's Draven could not learn to be decent, and I have loved you more with every single day since, watching you fight for what was yours with more courage than I have seen in any man or woman in this territory. Will you marry me?" The small crowd that had gathered outside the land office, drawn by curiosity over the morning's dramatic proceedings, had gone very quiet, watching, and Alberta found she did not care in the least who witnessed this moment, not after 2 months of hiding every true thing about herself. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and ringing and entirely without hesitation. "Yes, Hugh Mercer, I will marry you." He rose and kissed her then, right there in the street, to a scattering of applause from Amos Wheeler and his family, and the handful of townsfolk who had come to witness the fall of Otis Prute's crooked dealings, and stayed to witness something far sweeter. And Alberta Sawyer, who had ridden into the territory disguised as a man with nothing but grief and stubbornness to sustain her, rode home that evening beside the man she loved, under her own true name, toward a home that was, at long last, entirely and unquestionably her own. They were married 6 weeks later, in the same small church behind which they had first danced apart from prying eyes, with Amos Wheeler's wife sewing Alberta a dress of pale blue calico for the occasion, the first dress Alberta had worn since burning her old ones 2 months before, and finding, to her own surprise, that she did not miss the trousers and canvas coat half so much as she had expected, now that she no longer needed them for protection. Marshal Corbett, who had taken a particular interest in seeing the whole affair through to a happy conclusion, returned to stand as a witness, and even Mrs. Higgins from the boarding house wept openly through the ceremony, declaring she had suspected something unusual about that quiet young lodger from the very first week. Selah's Draven did not attend, having by then been forced by a territorial judge to pay substantial restitution for the burned barn and the cut fences, and having quietly sold off a portion of his own herd to cover the debt, a comeuppance that Amos Wheeler and the other small ranchers of the valley toasted with considerable satisfaction at the wedding supper that followed. Otis Prute had been dismissed from his post at the land office within the month, replaced by a younger clerk with no evident love for cattle barons, and a scrupulous devotion to procedure that made filing claims in Larkspur Crossing, for the first time in years, an honest business. Alberta and Hugh built a new life together on the banks of Willow Creek, expanding the cabin her father had built into a proper ranch house, with a wide porch facing west toward the hills where they had first taken shelter from the storm, and where Hugh had first spoken her true name aloud. They ran cattle together, Alberta proving as capable a rancher as any in the valley once she no longer needed to hide her competence behind a borrowed name, and their small herd grew steadily alongside the friendships they built with neighbors who had stood by them through fire and threat, and the long, uncertain weeks of that first difficult spring. In the autumn of 1877, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose land and whose courage he would inherit all the same, and Alberta held him in the same cabin where she had once slept fitfully with a pistol beneath her pillow, and wept with a happiness so full it felt like it might overflow the walls entirely. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Grace, after Hugh's own mother, and who grew up wild and quick and utterly unafraid of horses, riding before she could properly walk, much to her mother's proud amusement and her father's constant watchfulness. Alberta told her children, when they were old enough to understand it, the whole story of the disguise and the deadline and the long ride into the territory, not as a secret to be ashamed of, but as a lesson to be carried forward. That the law of the land did not always match the justice of a matter, that courage sometimes required cleverness alongside bravery, and that the people worth loving were the ones who saw past whatever disguise a person wore and recognized the truth of their character beneath it. Young Thomas, hearing the tale for the first time at the age of 7, sitting on the porch his mother had helped rebuild after Draven's men burned it, asked with wide-eyed seriousness whether his mother had truly fooled everyone in the whole territory. And Alberta had laughed and admitted that she had fooled nearly everyone, save for one sharp-eyed cowboy who had seen through her disguise within a single night by a campfire and loved her more rather than less, for the courage it had taken to wear it. Hugh Mercer, in the years that followed, became known throughout the valley not merely as Alberta Sawyer's husband, but as a rancher of considerable skill and fairness in his own right, a man other small outfits turned to for advice or assistance when trouble came calling, remembering well what it had cost to stand alone against a man like Silas Draven, and determined that no other family in the valley should have to face such trouble unsupported. Draven himself eventually sold what remained of his depleted operation and left the territory entirely, his reputation too thoroughly ruined by the scandal at the land office and the testimony of half the valley's ranchers to ever recover his former standing. And Larkspur Crossing grew, in the years that followed, into precisely the kind of honest, thriving town its early settlers had hoped it might become, free at last of the shadow his greed had cast over it. On quiet evenings, once the children were settled and the cattle counted, and the long Wyoming twilight stretched purple and gold across the hills, Alberta and Hugh would sit together on their porch, much as they had that first spring, and she would sometimes take from a small wooden box on the mantel the smooth creek stone he had offered her in place of a ring, worn now smoother still by years of handling, and turn it over in her fingers while he told her, as he told her often, that he had never in his life met anyone braver than the young man who had ridden into Larkspur Crossing calling himself Bert Sawyer, and never anyone lovelier than the woman that same young man had turned out, all along to be. "I would do it all again," Alberta told him once, on the evening of their 5th anniversary, watching their children chase fireflies in the last light of a summer evening across the same fields she had once plowed with bleeding hands to satisfy a law that had never quite known what to make of a daughter's devotion. "Every mile of that road, every lie I told to protect the truth of who I was, every night I feared discovery. I would ride it all again gladly, if it led me back to this same porch, this same land, and you." "You will never have to ride it again," Hugh said, drawing her close against his side as the stars began to prick through the deepening sky, the same wide Wyoming sky that had once seemed so vast and frightening to a lone traveler on a broken-down stagecoach, and that now felt, above the home they had built together, simply and entirely like shelter. "You are home now, Alberta Sawyer Mercer, exactly where you were always meant to be, and exactly who you were always meant to be, and I intend to spend the whole of my life making certain you never doubt either fact again." And there, beneath that endless Wyoming sky, on the land her father had left her, and the love she had found in claiming it, Alberta Sawyer finally, fully, and forever put down the last of her disguises, needing nothing more now than her own true name, spoken with tenderness by the man beside her, to carry her through all the good years still to come.